So my name's Kate Colvin. I'm the CEO of Homelessness Australia, and in organising this event, we've also worked with National Shelter and the Community Housing Industry Association. So many thanks to them for being involved. What we want to talk about today is the really challenging issue that is increasingly a problem in Australia, where we have all of these natural disasters. It seems like, where it used to feel like we'd have these natural disasters every 10 years or so, now it seems like we're having a couple of significant natural disasters a year that are then compromising a lot of housing in communities. So thousands of households losing their homes overnight, and then, of course, that generating a series of short, medium and long-term housing issues for the community. So what we're going to do is solve all of those problems, because we've got some fantastic speakers who know all the answers, but also this is an opportunity, and I'm sure many of you are probably joining because you're particularly interested and perhaps are living and working in communities that have been affected by natural disasters. So this is intended to be a conversation amongst everyone who's joined. And so we'll have, we've got 3 speakers, and then we'll open up and have time for a really great conversation. So really looking forward to everyone's input. I'm going to start by introducing Professor David Sanderson, who's an international expert in disaster recovery, with a focus on emergency housing support for disadvantaged communities displaced by natural disaster. So, David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Homelessness Australia, for organising this important event. And it's a privilege to meet everybody on this call. And there aren't many answers, as we were just chatting before we began. There's really complex, and I don't know, my personal view, cutting to the chase, is this is on the edge of the conversations when it comes to disasters and agencies and housing. It's hardly there, if at all. The good news about what I'm going to talk for no more than 10 minutes, and I'm very much the hors d'oeuvre. And so when we get to the main course, the 2 other speakers, of course, they have all the answers. So just to let you know, if I come up with pithy statements and nothing new, that's very deliberate. And years of not really knowing stuff, because it's also complex. But what I want to, I'm coming very much from the housing side, the disaster side, and most of my experience is actually other countries, the humanitarian aid world, but proudly Australian now, and feel very lucky living in this amazing country and working with organizations and agencies here. So I just want to talk about 3 challenges, and then talk about preparedness and response, and then about opportunities for change, the so what. I mean, it's all about so what. We don't want to get stuck in the problems. And I'll trot through this pretty quickly. I have no images to share, and I hope that's okay, because then we can maintain eye contact, and that's always nice. I'm not going to bore you with stats and statistics. I think you said it, Kate. Disasters are on the rise. It's a fact. Climate change, obviously, the increase of hazards, bushfires. We're about to enter a season of drought, and heaven forbid there'll be more fires. But anyone who knows about this stuff is thinking about it. And then floods, and of course heat. And as we know, there's so much. I won't talk about statistics, but anyone who wants to look at this from the IPCC reports, we are entering unprecedented, uncharted territory. Humanity has always risen to the challenge, and on another day there are conversations about that stuff. I choose to be an optimist, despite genuine challenges. The second point I want to make about the big picture is, as we all know, disasters affect the most vulnerable the worst. That's a global challenge. With apologies, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. The hazard, then the vulnerability, is people in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's those people who live on floodplains, and Ryan's going to talk about Lismore, I assume. People are living in the wrong place. It floods. We always knew that. And that's a common story. And people without the option to shift are stuck in places that are dangerous. Is a global phenomenon. 1 billion people live in informal settlements around the world, not because they love it, it's because there are a few choices about where you're going to live. So the more vulnerable you are, and what I mean by that is weaker social networks, people on the edges of society, people with less money, but maybe struggling with psychosocial issues or trauma or whatever it might be. And I'm assuming we're going to be talking more about that. And that's an absolutely key point. My third quick point on the big picture, as we all know, it wasn't like housing was okay before disasters. We're in a housing crisis, and Northern Rivers has a housing crisis. Unaffordability is there. It's increasingly a global issue. And in this rich, wonderful country, a huge number of people are unable to live in housing that even the generation before had. I quickly looked at, I mean, we'll all know this, an increase of 5% of homelessness between the 2016 and the 2021 census. And Kate, you're the expert on this and others in this room, so I won't say more about that. So the big picture, more disasters, most vulnerable, worst affected. It ain't like housing was okay and homelessness beforehand. So, but a bit more about preparedness and response. And what I mean about that is the before the disaster, getting rid of it, but then the terrible event happens, and then the after the disaster. And without getting too stuck, hopefully three or four observations, which hopefully are helpful for this conversation. Look, I'm no cynic, and it's easy to knock big governments and those things. I promise you I'm not. But there are systemic issues which repeat themselves in Australia and globally that we have not got our heads around. And the first one is this, that agencies, and I mean state and federal government and maybe community-based organizations too, but mostly the former, don't listen well enough to people. We're really bad at listening. And when I mean listening, it's engaging with people, saying, what do you really need and want, and how do we operate from a community-centered approach? And I'm going to come back to that. And don't just take my word for it. Over 5 years, 15 years ago to 10 years ago, Mary Anderson did a big study around the world, 5,000 people affected by disasters in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, Australasia. People said, thank you very much. You've saved my life often. You've helped me, and thank you. We're grateful for that. But after that, please go away. Stop listening. Stop not listening to us and infantilizing us. Actually, you're not listening. And, you know, a big problem is about engaging with people meaningfully. People are seen as victims in disasters, as the helpless victim. They're not actually. They're people who have survived. And our job is to support recovery. And I'm going to come back to why I think this is relevant, by the way. We've been doing our own study in Australia. We found that over half of people surveyed came back with, thank you, but you're not really listening to us. And these are the emergency responders who we deeply respect, but are not set up to listen or engage. It's more about the provision of support. On that, the system is extremely top down. I'm sitting in New South Wales. My wife works for the Reconstruction Agency. She's from an NGO background. She had to demonstrate her, quote, combat experience to work in a community-focused recovery organization. And community recovery and community engagement is not about combat. And I think one of the legacies of how we do disaster management is we focus, again, I'm choosing my words, not wrongly on the disaster, on the fire or the flood, but once that's gone or the fire's out, it's a different game. It's supporting people who are traumatized, who may be homeless, all kinds of things. And I come back, so I'm going to come back onto homelessness. People are more vulnerable in society who don't get listened to. A famous saying in disaster management is disasters expose the underlying vulnerabilities, but we don't look at that in recovery. We're focused on the stuff and not on the people. That brings me to my third point in this. Homeless people are largely ignored by the systems, not because we're evil, not because people are bad. I've never met an evil or a bad person involved in this stuff, but the systems conspire to make it really hard to actually not do business as usual, which is top down. Pods on properties assume you have properties. Rebuilding grants assume you've got something to rebuild. A safety net, a key one is insurance. If you don't pay rates, then you often are less in the picture. And as we know, homeless people, for whatever reasons, we know the complexities of that, and we come on to that for people who know way better than I do about that, are often out of that system. Community assessments often ignore people on the edges of society. And that's for all kinds of people who are perceived, and I'm choosing my words a little bit, to not be in the mainstream, whatever the right words are. If you don't have a door to knock on, you're invisible. Governments on the whole focus on things and not people. And some of us probably know Daniel Aldrich, who's been going around Australia the last few months, a real guru in this area from the US. He talks about social infrastructure. What really matters is your connectedness at the pub or the RSL or the cafe or the whatever it is, or the women's association or the whatever it is, or the men's sheds. It's your part of social capital, they call it, a connection. If you're out of that, you're on the edge. And it's investing in social infrastructure, he argues, is at least as important as the road or the bridge or the housing. And that's fascinating. That challenges government thinking. Loads of people in government who get this, but the systems yet aren't catching up. And I just say, fourthly, homelessness and disaster is hardly on the radar. I've been involved in this stuff for 32 years all over the place. And I was lucky enough to edit the State of the Humanitarian System report on post-disaster housing. We had about 60 people across the world. First time ever, a State of the System report 2019. And I'm ashamed to say the word homelessness is not in it. Just saying, just saying, it's not on the radar. For homework for this thing, I was looking up stuff. The University of Queensland, they may be on the call here, Sam Brookfield and Lisa Fitzgerald did some work on this, which is very powerful. They interviewed agencies working with homelessness and disaster. They found that homeless people, a sense of disconnection. This won't be news to anybody on this call. The importance of trust. People you knew before the disaster who you trust. And so the recovery centers, my wife has managed them up in Lismore. You know, I mean, it's hard because new faces come in, blow-ins. You don't know these people, you don't trust them, or you may trust them, but it's why not work with the systems? And I want to come back to that. Actually, I'll come back to that now. Opportunities for change. Oh, just one other piece of research I could find. It's from 1998 in Tokyo about how homeless people are off the radar when it comes to earthquakes. And Japan's incredibly good at this, by the way. And yet, anyway, just pointing out the fact that actually social issues may be off the radar. That's changed a bit, but not by enough. And I'll just finish with 3 opportunities for change. Meaningful support comes from charities and other community service organizations, especially at this level of local engagement when it comes to support and services for homelessness and other issues, your Vinnies or your Red Crosses or your Anglicas or whatever it might be. And government could do very well to actually think and recognize better how local service providers before a disaster continue after a disaster. And one of the great disconnects is that disasters disrupt societal fabric. This is a global systemic issue and actually disrupt those who were doing stuff beforehand with those doing stuff after them. We do a really bad job or a really good job at breaking those systems. And on another day, we could talk that. My second about what to do, opportunity for change, it is about decentralizing decision-making to council level. Councils across the world are overwhelmed and under-resourced, you name it. Today's news in the UK, where I'm from originally, Birmingham's just gone bust. That's the biggest council in Europe. It's the biggest council in Europe. They've just gone bust. You know, it's stuff like this, overwhelmed, under-resourced. Central government is disincentivized to support local government. But local recovery is always local. And if it's not local, forget it. And tons of evidence on that. And the third point I'd make is about focusing on relationships and trust. It's that social infrastructure. The global #1 thing around better recovery is social capital. It's supporting people and engaging and listening and that stuff. And systems are really bad at that. And I'll just add a caveat to that. We can rethink this. These are human constructs. Disasters aren't natural, and we can rethink this. And lots of people are rethinking this, calling for systemic change to support the local, to say politely to federal and state government, thank you very much, but actually please go away. You're important for a little bit of the story, but actually it's got to be locally led. And if you believe in community-centered recovery, which is the gold standard, you need to be serious about that. And that does mean to include people who are more marginalized in society. So I'll just get off my soapbox and hand over to the other 2 speakers. So thank you.
So much, David. That's great. So I now introduce Ryan Van Nieuwland, who's a senior lecturer in arts, design and architecture at UNSW, who wrote a report on, or did some study and then wrote a report on the Northern Rivers floods in 2022. So over to you, Ryan.
All right, thank you. Okay, hopefully you can hear me. I'm having issues with my headset, and hopefully you can see my slides as well. Is that, can I get a thumbs up?
Good.
They're both okay? Okay, thanks, guys. All right, so let me save myself having to turn my head too much. So basically, yeah, as Kate said, this is some findings that findings from a project that we did last year on the back of the floods in the Northern Rivers around Lismore. And you can see the report little cover there on screen. I'll share a link with that in a moment. I'll make these slides available too. I'll also sort of just disclose that the slide deck that I'm using today is me trying to condense a slightly longer presentation. So I'll do my best to keep it succinct, but it'll go at a clip. So don't worry too much. The slides will be available. The report is there. I'll basically sort of step through some of these key findings that you can see on screen now. And as I go through it, you will see some quotes from some of our participants that are, if you like, the evidence to back up these conclusions I'm drawing. But again, if you don't have a chance to read them because I'm going through too quickly, don't worry too much. But yeah, so the project overall was basically looking at those issues that David's been talking about. It's the fact that, one, we already have a challenging situation at the vulnerable end of the housing system, whether it's people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness, or in some other need of housing support, whether they're in an informal form of housing in the community or social housing sector, and some other parts of that vulnerable end of the housing system. So we've already got this challenge here. It's not a particularly resilient system, even in the absence of the challenges that a flood like we've experienced in the Northern Rivers can add to those systems. But then sort of coming off the back of what Kate mentioned at the top of this call, it's also the fact that these, even in the absence of a strange system existing before the floods, it's the fact that these floods also added strains to that system. It added to those people facing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And so I'll step through, like I say, these 6 key takeaways from that research, and hopefully have a chance to talk a bit about it at the end. So yes, that's working. Okay. Yes, look, the first was that this the not-for-profit sector was incredibly stretched. So we spoke with a number of people who were involved in providing homelessness services, providing housing services, and actually, I think I saw Kathy on the call here. So hello, Kathy. She was one of the participants and funders of this piece of research. So people who were providing homelessness services or community services, even before the floods, were just found that they were stretched, and they were stretched in 3 ways. And look, this is not particularly surprising, but it's important to sort of unpack the fact that there are multiple dimensions to this. The first is, as I say, they're business as usual services. People who provide homelessness services, there was an extra demand for those services. So they were stretched in that respect. They were also rolled into, and this is touching on what David mentioned as well, they were also rolled into the recovery process. The fact that these community networks, which involved a lot of those social sector organizations, civil society, include academia in that, but the social sector organizations were sort of got rolled into that community response and recovery. And so again, they were sort of stretched by having to provide new services, part of the emergency response and recovery process. And then the third way they were stretched was the fact that a lot of these communities a lot of these organizations exist within the communities that are affected. And so resources were taken offline, whether it was their offices, whether it was their staff, or other aspects as well. So it was a challenging time for the sector. There were 2 inquiries on the back of the Northern Rivers floods, and I won't sort of focus on this too much, other than to say it was notable that they recognised this challenge, that in those inquiries they recognised the fact that local civil society was so instrumental in the response and recovery. And it was interesting, though, that they talked about increasing the capacity of those civil society organizations as part of the recovery process, but they tended to talk more about individual capacity in the immediate response. And I think that undermined the fact that, again, in that immediate response, so much of what enabled individuals to connect with each other and find the support they needed and respond to the immediate emergency was coming through those existing community organizations. So the suggestion is that, well, this is unfortunately a new normal. We have a situation, as David mentioned, where, and as Kate mentioned as well, these sorts of events are not one-offs, that there is a sense that you sort of tend to lurch from one crisis to another, and that some of the organizations we were speaking to, I think the quote on screen here speaks to this, is that, you know, these sort of short-term things are basically it's just another part of the business as usual for the service providers. But that has resourcing implications, because so much of the resourcing that is provided in response to a disaster like the floods in the Northern Rivers is a sort of short-term pot of money that has to be spent immediately, or has to be spent on a particular program or activity, which makes it really difficult for these organizations to have any stability over the longer term. If this is going to become part of their business as usual, to be part of the emergency recovery, a disaster recovery process, then they need to be more strategically resourced to do so. Second one I want to talk about is the fact that the impacts, particularly for people at that vulnerable end of the housing system, spread much further than you might think of as being flood affected in the immediate sense. And that's because so much of the system was strained in the area around Lismore and the other parts of the Northern Rivers that were flood affected. So what was happening was that people who were seeking homelessness services or were seeking some supports around that space were going geographically much further afield to find organisations that had that sort of capacity. They were also having to go much further afield to find temporary accommodation. So I'm using a lot of jargon here that might be New South Wales specific, apologies if that's the case, but the temporary accommodation is part of the homelessness support services that we have in New South Wales. But again, a lot of those options were not available around Lismore, around Ballina, and so people who are facing homelessness that would be looking for that sort of temporary accommodation are having to go further afield. And we're also seeing that the private rental sector, which I'll come back to in a moment, was also significantly constrained. And so people who were looking for affordable rentals, and when I by affordable, I just mean low cost, were also having to go much further afield. And so that had real implications for those individuals, particularly the fact that they were disconnected from the sorts of services that they had already connected with. They were also disconnected from economic opportunity, which is kind of like jargon, if you like, for saying a lot of these people in vulnerable positions have cash jobs, have very informal work experiences, and it is through word of mouth and through like personal connections. So if you're having to relocate from Lismore up to Casino, you're sort of losing those word of mouth opportunities for income and jobs, and so that had implications for those individuals. And I am in no way qualified to speak to it, but there is an extra dimension that did come up, which is if you are talking about Indigenous communities, any displacement, any sense that they have to go further afield, those parts of the community have to go further afield, they're also being separated from country, and that has significant implications, which again, I should stress, I think we're qualified to speak to, but we'll hang a lantern on it because it's an important issue, particularly in regional areas. So again, there's an interesting thing that came through the research is that there is a role for the not-for-profit sector here because they are structured in a very networked way across a much broader geography. And a very sort of specific example of this came through that the local tenant advocacy up in the Northern Rivers, that their phone was like literally ringing off the hook constantly, but the community advocacy service more broadly across New South Wales are able to set up, and don't ask me how, a very specific sort of telephone triage system that meant that calls could get redirected to other tenant advocates in other parts of the state that had more capacity to answer those phone calls. And so that's like a very literal sense of a network, but it was the fact that not-for-profit organisations like Red Cross, like St Vincent de Paul, like Mission Australia, are connected geographically more broadly, and so can mobilise volunteers, can mobilise donations, can actually provide, if the impacts are going to get spread further for those people who are vulnerable, then these organisations are also able to spread their supports geographically further as well. So as well as spreading further, the impacts for people at the vulnerable end of the housing spectrum, the impacts lasted longer. And the first sort of thing that was kind of interesting here was the fact that so much of the immediate response was people finding informal support. So they're able to stay with a friend, right? This is what you can imagine here. But after several months, suddenly staying with a friend is not a feasible option. But if there is no alternative, it's at that point, several months after a flood, that you actually turn to the government and start asking for emergency accommodation. And this is exactly the time when the government was hoping to. They didn't in the case of the floods. They sort of recognised that there was a long tail to this and were able to continue providing emergency accommodation. But the expectation was that it would start to wind down as they started finding more semi-permanent, if not permanent, options for people who were already in emergency accommodation. It was the fact that they were being replaced with a new demand for those services coming much later. So again, this is people that for whom the semi-permanent or permanent housing situation just was not going to emerge in that short term. There is, I'll talk to it in a moment, but there was just no emergency accommodation. Sorry, there was no temporary accommodation for people facing homelessness. A lot of those informal options went offline as well. Community housing, social housing sector was completely derailed. And so this idea that people could stay with their friends for a bit but then were looking for housing support were people who were, like I say, at risk of homelessness, more longer term homelessness. Yeah, sorry, I just spoke to that, which is good. Which is just the fact that, yeah, the options for people facing homelessness or looking for housing support took a lot longer to come back online after the floods, and so this was the challenge that was faced the emergency response sector. Again, I think I was getting a bit ahead of my slides because I've already spoken to this, but this was the fact that what we saw in the immediate aftermath was we went from the evacuation centres, and then from evacuation centres, people were being put in emergency accommodation, and emergency accommodation took a number of forms, but if you want to sort of have a visual, imagine a motel room. So people were being put into motel rooms as a sort of an emergency accommodation. But the question was how much those options were suitable for people facing homelessness. And, you know, we did hear some very, very traumatic stories about people who had been rough sleeping, had gone to the evacuation centres, had found an opportunity for them to stay in a caravan on a caravan park. They contracted COVID. The caravan park owner then turned them away. And they ended up back sleeping rough on the streets of Lismore with COVID in the middle of a flooding event. Like, it was tragic, it was horrible. And so the fact that structure, that process of housing people after the floods was not really set up for people with very specific needs, or more challenging needs. And this goes to David's point that this is sort of on the edge of the edge. You've got a homelessness response that's struggling, and you've got an emergency response that's struggling, and the intersection of that Venn diagram was particularly struggling. The other thing that came out, again, sort of speaking to this, is that a lot of those temporary options, the emergency accommodation, was not suitable for people with pets, not suitable for people with disabilities, not suitable for people who needed those sort of wraparound services. I won't dwell too much on the pod villages, which was a particular response to the Northern Rivers floods, but if there's questions about it, we can come back to it. I'd like to say that it was a new idea, and there's a lot of value to the idea, but it was not particularly thought through. It wasn't particularly clear what their role was. In the past, when these dongers, these temporary, these manufactured homes had been made available, they were, as David mentioned, on people's property. So while they're renovating their house, they can sort of stay in the donga while the thing gets repaired, while the home gets repaired. But they went through a different option up in the Northern Rivers, where they started putting these manufactured homes, these pods, in villages on particular sites. And for people who were renovating their own homes, this was not ideal because those villages were not in the right location. And in the end, the pod villages served a very important role. They're managed by community housing providers for providing housing for people who were vulnerable. So it sort of fell into this role of filling the gap for people who were facing a vulnerable housing situation after the floods. But the problem is that was never sort of explicitly the case and was not particularly articulated or planned for. And so it did mean that there was a lot of community opposition, and it was particularly challenging, again, that these things were not rolled out in a transparent way that the community was able to understand and come on board with. The final one that I want to talk about is what happened to the private rental sector, which is a step away from homelessness, but as you'll see, it's evident how it's connected. But in particular, there was some challenges here. So I mentioned the not-for-profit sector having a three-way stretch, and here the private rental sector's got a three-way squeeze. But basically, we had people who would normally be in owner occupation needing something to rent, while they were repairing their home. So there was more demand for private rental coming from more stable housing options of home ownership. But we also saw that a lot of informal options, the sort of granny flats, the caravan parks, whatnot, they were the housing options that were knocked offline through flood damage. And so what was happening was that there was more people coming from more informal, more insecure housing looking for stuff on the private rental market. So there was more demand from below, shall we say. And again, couple all this with the fact that a lot of housing was knocked offline because of flood damage. And you've got this sort of three-way squeeze where there's just huge demand and limited supply for private rental. And when that happens, as you can imagine, prices started rising. So it was kind of interesting to sort of compare what was happening on the Northern Rivers with my previous research and experience of rental markets here in Sydney, which is the fact that there was just very few substitutes. That, again, if somewhere like the Hills District here in Sydney was, experienced floods as they did last year as well, it's sort of connected in some respects to the rest of Sydney's housing market. And so there are other substitutes for the housing that's lost. But when you're in a small town, there are, I can't move 3 towns over because there's no public transport connecting me with that same rental market. So it does become a form of dislocation and displacement. So they're very small markets to start with, as in there's not that many dwellings in these small towns. But then couple that with the fact that private rental is quite small, and couple that with the fact that only a proportion of private rental will actually be a low cost, be affordable to someone on a low income. Couple that with the fact that you might be looking for specific needs. Maybe you need an accessible shower. Maybe you need 4 bedrooms because you're a large multi-generational family. Maybe you've got pets, and so you need someone to take pets. It just becomes, it's sort of like, as you filter out all the things that don't tick these criteria, it becomes very, very small, very, very niche, and very, very hard for people to find suitable accommodation on the private rental sector. So it's a particular challenge for a housing system that before the floods was really not set up for the sorts of need for private rental, and it was just not able to respond in time. At the low cost end of the private rental sector, there was another aspect of this, which is the fact that we tended to see these are houses that were provided by what we might call passive landlords. These are people that own a home and they rent it out. They rent it out fairly cheaply. Maybe they rented it out for 10, 20 years and the rents haven't kept pace with market rents, because they're not particularly actively involved in, well, it can be a problem as well in the private rental sector, keeping maintenance and upkeep and whatnot of the dwelling. But in some sense, this provides the below median. This is the, when you have a median rent, someone's got to be below that median. These older dwellings with passive landlords were not looking to maximize their returns, tended to be those landlords. After the floods, these landlords were like staring down the barrel of very high insurance premiums, looking at repairs and various other costs, and as well as the actual dollar value of it that they were looking at the barrel of, staring down the barrel of. They're also looking at the fact that this is going to be taking a lot of their attention. And yet these are the landlords who are trying to be passive, not particularly active, involved in managing the asset. And so they were increasingly cashing in. And again, if someone's buying that house now, there's a chance it won't stay on the private rental market, particularly in the Northern Rivers, where a lot of there's challenges around Airbnb. But even if it stayed in the private rental market, the fact that someone has bought it now at current market prices means they're looking for a certain yield, which means the rent they're going to be charging is not that low cost rent. And so what we have seen somewhat in the Northern Rivers is this sort of structural shift. This is not just a temporary spike in demand and loss of supply that's increasing prices. It's the fact that the private rental sector is starting to shift away from providing a naturally low-cost option for people who can afford that price point. And again, there's a quote here which speaks to that. In the absence of naturally low-cost housing options, it does speak to the need that these are probably areas where we are going to need more social housing, more subsidised housing options, and yet these are markets that have historically not required that level of subsidy or input from the social housing sector because the private rental market has provided that option. All right, I'll wrap up. So like I said, there were particular challenges because this was a regional context, I think, and that needs to be kept in mind, that you cannot apply solutions and apply responses that will work in large metros. You need to think about the fact that these are small, fairly isolated markets that are going to need additional support. And yeah, look, again, my other sort of 2 points on this slide are points that have been made by David and Kate already, which is the fact that this is a new normal. We do need to recognize that the emergency response apparatus has some permanence about it. But also it's interesting to note that a lot of the responses, as in providing more social housing, providing more homelessness services, these are not new solutions. These are what you might call good planning anyway. But the fact that we need to have more resilience built into those systems because of the increasing prevalence or increasing intensity of climate disasters It's just a new reason, if you like, for those old solutions that we've heard about before. Stop sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. That's really interesting. So before we get to questions, we're going to flip to from the east coast of Australia right over to the west to hear from Amanda Dexter, who's the CEO of the Shire of Derby and West Kimberley. And of course, the Kimberley area had massive floods in January 2023. And as the head of the council, Amanda was very involved in responding to that. So over to you, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I haven't been able to get any slides prepared. So I'm just going to actually have a bit of a chat with you all. You wouldn't believe it, but we're absolutely in the full throes of our temporary 12 to 18 months housing solution being rolled out. We have 60 days until we are due to be cut off again from well, actually, we kind of become the island of the Shire of Derby, West Kimberley. But our community, Fitzroy Crossing, which was our most inundated, as many of you know, the National Bridge went out there, and we have 60 days until they forecast our first rain. And given that we, similar to the East Coast, had the biggest flood on record, over 15 metres. Prior to that, it had been at 13 odd. We also had significant rain in July of this year, which took out our river crossings again. We have a Bridge Alliance that's madly trying to build a new bridge, but unfortunately that does take time. They are due to be finished in March, which would be under a year, sorry, under a year. Yeah, we're 60 days from rain, and that will mean that 9 of our fringe communities and many of the people that live on the eastern side of the Fitzroy River will be cut off again from the western side. And it's a 9,500 kilometre trip to actually make it to the other side unless you catch boats and different things. So we'll be back to having incredible freight issues. We'll be back to incredible family displacement. The Fitzroy Valley spans from Halls Creek. I'm not sure how many of you know your geography well, but about 4 hours out of Kununurra, south west is Halls Creek. 2 hours from that is Fitzroy Crossing, then 2 hours to Derby, and then 2 hours to Broome type thing. Well, Fitzroy Crossing is where the bridge gets cut at the moment. And in order to get to the east coast, and to Darwin and Halls Creek is a 9,500 kilometre journey. So incredibly vast and huge. We had the town of Derby as well cut off for 8 weeks or so during our flooding. We had to choose between eating and getting power during all of those times. And so the communities have been through an incredible amount of trauma. Our communities have over 80% Indigenous populations. We have 54 Aboriginal communities and 3 town sites with that sort of 80 to 85% Indigenous population. So it's been very, very interesting times. We're probably a little fortunate that the bridge plays such a big role, because I'm not sure, watching the government wane at the moment in their efforts, that if we didn't have such a national impost and oil and all sorts of different things couldn't get across to the east from Broome and the impact on the pastoral industry, that we would still be getting the attention that we're getting. Look, the federal and the state government have been incredible, but you know, you watch the curtains, you watch sort of the eyes close a little bit at the minute when you talk about homelessness and issues like that. Anyway, I was just trying to set some context, because as much as some of my numbers won't be as profound as I know some on the East Coast, we just can't take away the incredible level of impact, you know, the fact that it's our isolation and our remoteness is profound, and our economy of scale just really changes everything as well. So we talk about the fact that across the West Kimberley, and that's what I'll refer to, and that's those towns, we had 11 impacted communities. And we talk about the fact that it ripped the Band-Aid off 25 years of dysfunction. And so the West Kimberley was grappling before this and it's grappling more now. Look, there's some incredible benefits that are coming out of it, but we had a pretty dysfunctional way of life prior to the flood, and the flood has just, brought with it an avalanche of issues. Many of our houses generally weren't fit for purpose. We had a really unique experience in that about 5 weeks in, when the local government and the local prescribed body corporates and the rangers and things could start to actually really partake in the response. We're taking on board some of what the other speakers have said. We weren't listened to initially. The local content wasn't respected, but we did finally get there in the end. But when we could finally get our own environmental health officers and rangers and navigators and everything into the community working with people, we had to turn around some of the decision making. So DFS, our emergency services department, had brought in all of these housing assessors, and they'd condemned over 70% of 1,000 homes, when only 400 homes had had a level of impact because of the standard of living. Well, that's our normal standard of living. And so everybody was sort of really grappling. And whilst that was great news for us on a level to finally perhaps get on the national stage that the standard of living wasn't appropriate, we weren't in a position to lose that many homes, and it was pretty huge. So we were able to get our own EHOs in, and we utilised the Kimberley and the top of the Pilbara, who all work in these environments and live with this kind of poverty, I suppose. And we've been able to put it back to about 200 homes that have been severely impacted and that require significant major build or rebuild completely. There's no land in the Shire of Derby West Kimberley. What's available at the moment is quite minimal. Housing is at an absolute extreme shortage. We've got the highest demographic of 15-year-olds at the moment, and so we're incredibly mindful of what's coming on. We have 25% of our population that's homeless and sleeps rough every given day. And there's no land. It's tied up in native title and ILUAs and a whole range of different circumstances. We are hoping that there will be some pressure that comes on this. The federal government have pledged 80 homes at the moment to Build Back Better, which will be a great support, there's no question. And we're hoping that we can utilise that opportunity to look at some kinship housing, some different scenarios. Many of our homeless or rough sleepers really don't have to be homeless, but for lots of different cultural reasons and the humbug and all sorts of things don't want to be living in housing that's traditional. So we're hoping that we can also expand the government's mind to looking at some options that might provide a solution to support the rough sleepers. It's not a normal economy, so we're very much that service support economy. A lot of the things that were in place to drive economic business have moved to the coastal fringe, and so we're the less desirable inland area, and many people aren't here to set up house or to live forever unless they're the TOs. Most people are in a service industry, and so the general sort of home that gets on the market and buys and sells and those sorts of things aren't there. So listening to stuff about rental markets and everything, we just don't even have any of that. And culturally, as I said before, many of the homes just don't provide a cultural solution. Anyway, so progressing on, I think if I'm getting a bit caught up, please bring me back on track, anyone. It's such a wide and diverse issue that there's sort of so much you kind of want to get out whenever you're talking about it. A few things that we had is social emotional support was really slow, and the government knew that housing was an issue. We had over 500 displaced people. A general house had on average 20 people associated to it, as much as 35 people associated to it. and many were evacuated from the region. It all happened so quickly. It really was quite a profound and unique circumstance that hadn't occurred before. And so at one point in time, we didn't even know where everyone was. And I think we're still short in finding about 30 people and where they are. What we know is that we generally, in the town of Derby, 2 and a bit hours away from Fitzroy Crossing and a few of the big communities out that way, have about 70 rough sleepers that sleep on the fringe of our marsh, we call it. We do a great deal of supports with them with outreach. That has grown to about 140, and we have 11 new homes that are being squatted in Derby on top of the general homes that were being squatted in before that, which are sort of all old asbestos homes. So there's incredible health issues and things. There's been a number of reasons, I think. One is that the solution initially for temporary housing was the Humani huts. I hear you refer to pods. I'm not quite sure what that was. The Humani huts are a bit like a sea container. I think there's one window in them, but some of the solutions don't have windows in them. You know, how do you get a rough sleeper to sleep in a windowless place? They did have air conditioning and different things, but the drama was they couldn't be set up uniquely. They had to be set up in this sort of village type environment, and they had shared bathrooms and different things, and that's not, again, sort of culturally appropriate. So they didn't get taken up on the level. There was actually a great sense of the community feeling that it was a poor option, and so a lot of people have moved out to Broome and Derby. Equally, there is a pull to alcohol, and during those early days, whilst the Fitzroy Crossing community is dry, there's a great deal of sly grogging normally, which is a scourge. But at the same time, when it wasn't able to get in there at all because we were cut off for so long as an island, the whole Shire, people did their best to get out and to be able to access alcohol and stuff. And so that is where I think too we've had a number that haven't come back. We're just now 8 months in. We have a couple of local elders that can tell us, to the day, how many days in we are. And starting next week, we have a number of sort of more donga-like housing going in for the wet season, and probably the next 12 to 18 months, temporary housing. These all have to go in at 1.8 metres high, roughly. And so they'll have ramps and all sorts of different things, need to be disabled, of course. They will provide an interim solution. I'm not sure it will really tackle our homeless numbers. It will mean that the Humani huts come out, and these are a replacement for that. But as I said, we've got 11 communities that could easily be inundated, and so these will go in a bit higher and enable people to go back to their country. But I don't think that they will be supporting the homeless side of things. We are looking at a shelter and a number of them across the Shire, sort of on the edge of the communities and not so visual in the centres of town, where we can do food. Orange Sky supports us with washing services, and we've just, through our Lotteries West, in the process of having 2 big semi-trailers with toilets and showers and things built, and hopefully they'll be ready for November, that will provide the opportunity that they can move around and go out to some of these shelters, and people can have their, do their ablutions reasonably regularly. There's only 2 coming at the moment across 120,000 square kilometres. But anyway, they'll help. It's a service we didn't have before. And we're lifting a number of homes that weren't on a concrete pad, so that they'll be higher, and that will hopefully also keep people associated to those areas. So that's another thing at the minute, is that with the homeless, we're just not sure where they're all going to. And look, they're incredibly resilient, and they're, so strong. It's really amazing. But we've lost the connections to their homes that they sort of always had. And so we are trying to put some of those things back on the ground in the areas that we know they like to be, so that then they're still popping in and having dinner with the family once a week or something and keeping that connection. So that's some of our really big sort of opportunities for this season. The alcohol sort of and drugs, so they have moved a little bit to other drugs, which has really been quite sad. And we're finding that because alcohol is hard to get in because it's bulky, that's what's probably led us to some of the other drugs and things, which is really concerning. We have just now, 8 months in, had a social emotional wellbeing outreach program put in place by the Department of Communities, and that includes mental health. So we are hoping that we can start to tap in to people more. But I think sort of overall, the really big takeaways have been that in the areas that perhaps are at risk, to be doing this level of planning well in advance, and perhaps trying to have those really robust, strong conversations about the issues that you have is just so incredibly important, because trying to support these services, these people with services that were inadequate in the first place on the fly has been, profound. And the sentiment of the community is so quickly brought back to where they were. So you can often try and grow some spirit and some hope and get them a little happier, but very quickly, when everyone sees what's really going on underneath, that sort of lowers itself again. And that's been something that I know that for all the workers that are in there doing the very best they can, it's taken a lot to keep everybody's spirits up. We've also had some real complexities in that just general accommodation, so even accommodation for support workers. And so, like at the minute, I've got 11 staff sleeping on swags in offices, showering in the public toilets. That's been going on for 8 months. We're trying our hardest. We've got a Rio Tinto remote camp that's come in that will hopefully be able to provide some increased accommodation. And we are looking also at another camp coming out of Darwin for the season. And we're looking to putting an eastern hub on the other side so that we can have medical officers, an ambulance, and some helicopters and things that can access the eastern side for the probably 3 to 4 months that will be cut off. So yeah, it's been a big full-on undertaking. And we've had to be mindful about some of the things, lining up to get supplies, lining up for dinners and things that has triggered terrible traumas back to the old days. And so getting rations and all sorts of different things. So we've had to try and set things up very differently, and make sure that it's more of a home-like environment. And so even when we go out and do our outreach for meals and those sorts of things 3 nights a week, that we set up everything in a big round circle, and nobody sort of has to line up anymore and things like that, because the traumas that were being triggered was incredibly significant and quite huge for us. So that's another thing where we're just having to be really mindful. So I think, look, it comes back to the fact that just, some of our areas, and I know from doing some research and talking, Lismore's reached out a lot to us and given us some great supports. And we've had a number of the universities and things that, we're no exclusive club in terms of, the circumstances we were living in, and what was the 20 years of sort of inadequacy. It's just that when you put something on top like this, we've got 10 years before we probably get our heads together. At the minute, we failed in our first lot of housing rebuild tenders and things. So, and they were, I think they were looking at $1 million build because of how remote and with some of the social complexities per dwelling. So we're going to need to really go out there and understand, what are we going to do in that space? we've got a hell of a lot of asbestos and stuff like that to get rid of as well. So anyway, it's onward and upward though. We've got a big event coming up, which we hope will bring some more hope in about another month. And we're trying our hardest to help everyone understand what the wet season again will bring. As I said, at least now it's quite known. Bar a few, we can tangibly touch our sort of 400 to 500,000 people that are really affected every day, and the 30 or 40 staff across a number of different agencies and the Shire through the Recovery Hub in Fitzroy and Derby, you know, work every day to try and help these guys get back on their feet. But they're sort of all still homeless, and we need to, you know, try and find a way through this. I hope that was helpful. I can ask more questions. You can ask me,
Amanda, but it's quite a lot, isn't it? Like, it's quite a situation that you're dealing with. So all power to you in responding to that scenario. Just a really practical question. I'm just wondering, can you just describe what's different about a donga compared to the Humani huts?
Yeah. So well, we call them dongas over here. I'm not sure what you would call them, but they're the sort of, I suppose, again, they're a 3 metre wide, sort of 12 to 18 metre long. They can sit on the back of a truck, but in that they will have a bedroom at each end, and then they will have a living area and a small kitchen and things. So at the moment with the Humani hut, they've been a very small, like, little sea container that a bed and a chair pretty much went in. And then there was communal kitchen and bathrooms and different things. And actually, I think everyone's got their own bathrooms as well. So these are going back to sort of more family-centred homes rather than this village pod-like arrangement, which we have learned that as much as the, you know, everybody was so quick to sort of say, oh, the Indigenous love, you know, being communal and everything. Well, not on every level. And people really underestimated what that sort of meant and how it worked. So this will be great, we hope, to put back some normalcy.
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's interesting, you know, that the number of homes that were in a not very livable condition was 700, only 400 of them impacted by floods, 200 condemned, but the government are contributing 80. So, you know, at every level you think, well, you know, what about the 120 who homes still need to be rebuilt that are not in dongas, and they're probably bigger houses than a donga anyway, and then also the other sort of unlivable homes. So obviously there's a huge task there. Look, I've got lots of questions, but I wonder if perhaps I open up to the audience to see if people have questions, and then if people don't, I will come up with one. Just have to change it so I can actually see. Sorry, and I'll just got to do a tech thing. So now I can see everyone.
I posted a link to the pod villages for people that sort of want to get some idea of it, and it's probably somewhere between the two things you were describing, Amanda. They are dongas, as you might call them that, but yeah, they're very cheap by jowl.
I think so. There's a question in the chat. I think someone did ask for you, Amanda, whether or not this flooding event occurs every year.
So no, not on this level. I think there's been 3 significant floods in the history of the Fitzroy Valley since the 80s. This has been the highest by far, and the most significant in terms of damage. We do get some isolation out to some of our communities each year. It will depend on the level of rain. And this year, normally being an El Nino, if we hadn't have had the flood last year, this would be a little bit of a phew. But as I said, the aquifers and the water levels and things are as high as they've ever been. So no, we don't. And like I said, this was profound. This is, I think it's being termed as the worst disaster in Western Australia in living history. Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty full on. So I just wonder, obviously, just hearing what David's saying, we want to focus on people and not just on, the sort of housing product. But I am very interested in terms of that planning, local planning around the different sort of housing types that are needed for people who are in different circumstance, and sort of wondering to what extent they need to be planned for differently. So obviously thinking of people if they already if they own a home that's been destroyed, but there's still land that's usable, and whether or not that can accommodate a donga or another temporary accommodation unit. But then for people who are renting, that might not be a suitable option. So is there another medium-term option? And then for people who didn't have a home, what's the sort of housing option that's needed for them to be safe and to have some housing while that community is going through the recovery? And then I guess we've got the really unique situation, though it's replicated many times across the country, of communities where there's not a sort of formal rental sector, but there's, basically most people are living in housing that's, whether it's owned by the Land Trust or by Aboriginal community organisation or by the state, and then large numbers of those homes being delivered. So I'm just wondering, in terms of planning for that housing need that's created, not just for people who are homeless, but also for people who were housed but are homeless as a consequence of the disaster. If you've ever seen a situation, David, where that's been done well in other locations, or even if you haven't seen it, like, what can you think of a process that would be the process to follow to kind of plan to resolve those housing issues?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kate. And I just wanted to say thanks, Amanda, for highlighting the complex realities of all that stuff. There's no solution here. I just posted that report I mentioned, the State of Humanitarian Shelter and Settlements 2019, and it's global. It's Africa, Asia, Latin America, all over the place. Dozens of people contributing about their experiences to do with this stuff. And a quick summary would be that, so I'm going to come to your question, Kate, but I think it's important. Temporary shelter across the world is pretty discredited. It's incredibly expensive. It's never temporary. The political will is gone by the time you come to the end. And after 2 years, what are you going to throw people off? We all know it's really hard, and it's had a very bad reputation for many, many years, actually. That said, it's not like there's a simple solution elsewhere. Rental markets, accommodations, homestays, moving away, none of these are good. In poorer countries, it's more accepted. People live in tents, and I'm not saying that's good for a second, by the way. After Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the best the global shelter thought it could do was meet half the needs of people, half the needs. And this is a middle-income country. So, the story of this has been a difficult one. So I think it's a reality to acknowledge that. And again, not be mired in despond of what you can't do, but just to say it's really hard. But there's a gigantic question mark over temporary shelter. There's decades of evidence on that front. That said, what are you going to do? A Swiss think tank called SCAT about 10 years ago did quite a bit of work on this, about different sheltering options. I think once you talk about sheltering options, it's quite powerful. And rentals and B&Bs. And again, I know, there's nothing good about this. People want a family of 5 living in one room with a shared bathroom, and you get extensions every week and all that stuff is happening in Lismore. So, but there's a huge question mark in the temporary shelter. If you had a lot of money to spend, would you really spend it on that with all the infrastructure and the problems, the NIMBYism? And I think that's sadly unfolding in this country, as it has everywhere else. Sorry to say, there's no joy in saying that. Just back on to what you're saying, Kate. It's not about the disaster. The whole point about this whole stuff is that it's not about that immediacy of the event. The event exposes all the other stuff around, the housing crisis, the psychosocial mental problems, the rest. And the problem is that when we do disaster response collectively, we focus on the disaster. And I know it's like a total oxymoron, but that's the problem. We're looking at the disaster because it's all the stuff around it that's the issue. It's the slow burn. So this should be in the purview of social workers, not emergency responders. It should be the lawyers about the land and the stuff and where you don't build and all that stuff. And that's the slow burn. And that doesn't help if you just lost your house right now. But if we are going to correct this long term, and there's lots of experience around long-term removal and eradication of risk. And in the parallel world of fires in towns, just throwing it out there, I mean, take Norway, lots of timber buildings, there were fires. The council put in the idea that actually after a fire, you will not build in wood anymore, and eradicated the frequency of disasters. And we do have to have the long-term view. The problem is we have short political cycles. And that's another global systemic issue, that we have short-term gains, the rest, when actually the issues here we're all talking about are all about the long-term fixes, every single thing we're talking about. And the rubber hits the road when a disaster exposes the awfulness. When it comes to homelessness, it does come back to social capital, the social infrastructure, the existence of long-term organizations that get blown out of the water by the emergency crowd who seems to think that they're in charge now, and they shouldn't be when it comes to recovery.
Thanks, David. Ryan, did you want to say anything about, sort of your overview of the Lismore floods, if sort of taking a step back, like what would have, if there'd been the ideal plan, what would have the plan looked like to provide sheltering options for people affected?
Yeah, look, I'll just make one comment, which was the fact that there were a lot of people who were experiencing homelessness beforehand were suddenly opened with a whole bunch of opportunities that had never been made available to them through the emergency response, through the fact that there was a whole bunch of emergency accommodation brought online, through things like the pod villages. But it was not designed for that purpose, and so in many respects it wasn't fit for that purpose. And so I think just really echoing what David just said at the end there, which is the fact that this was an awkward space in the sense that this was a different agency. This was, someone in charge of emergency response trying to provide social services. And it seemed like an unnecessary sort of replication or reinvention of the wheel when there are organizations who, if given the resources and capacity, would probably be much more well positioned to provide those support services. And so I think, in terms of like what would the plan be, it would be about making sure that those longer term services are more well-resourced, there's more resilience built into it, to use the jargon of choice around disaster response, to have resilience built into it so that when there is a spike in demand or when there is increase in need for services or more diverse services or slightly different services, that they have capacity to provide that.
Thanks, Ryan. And Amanda, just thinking about that point that David's making about, and that you made also about it, exposed all of these issues. I guess sort of thinking about, if it probably is the case that we'll see another serious flood, over the next 10 years in the community. I hope that we don't, but you can imagine that might be a likely outcome. What would the housing, if you could sort of wave a magic wand and construct housing that actually could survive that disaster, what would it look like for the community to be well housed?
Yeah, look, it's going to be really complex because sadly, and this is, I suppose that, the absolute issue is that people want to be on country, and on country is in a floodplain that with the way that the water came this time and the way that the river has changed its trajectory, I'm not sure that some of the communities can, withstand a wall of water like that again. But as I said, and I could, if we have some contact details, I could send out some of the housing plans that are coming on board. David made a good point. It'll be interesting to see what's temporary and how we really get there in the end with really permanent housing. But they are sort of nearly 2 meters high. All living areas have been, the floor level's been lifted to be above what's projected to be sort of a 1 in 500, which is very intriguing, flood level, and all sort of other communal, not so important laundries and different things are on the ground. So it's a really interesting one. We've got to find a way to build, ramps, because so much of the community, so there's a high proponent portion of the community, sorry everyone, that has disability or is aging, and so ramps and different things are going to be really quite intriguing. But yeah, there's a great deal of work at the moment. The community isn't open to entertaining moving off those sort of areas, which obviously would be a solution, but still trying to stay in the vicinity of the country. Yeah, it's going to be complex. But look, there's lots of work happening. I probably failed to say that, and Lisa, Terry, I was just trying to write you a response. We do have a flood recovery working group which brings together the prescribed body corporates. There's been a move to working direct with them, and not so much the Aboriginal corporations who are sort of funded by government as such. It's the prescribed body corporates by the federal government have been empowered to do a lot of the work, really representing their members' needs and issues. So that's been a positive thing, and at the moment that's where the voice is coming from, and so hence why we are looking at solutions for them to stay on country and a whole range of things. But it does still leave them vulnerable, unfortunately, Kate, and time will tell.
Thank you. There's a question from Kevin. I'm just checking, I think, sorry, just before I get to that, the question from Lisa, I think you just answered that, Amanda, didn't you, about how governments interacted with the land groups. So then there's a question from Kevin about how other regions have an EMP, emergency management plan for rough sleepers in extreme weather. I don't think, I'm based in Victoria, I don't think that there's an emergency management plan for rough sleepers in extreme weather in Victoria. I wonder if anyone else would like to comment on that. Anastasia, yeah, jump in.
Hey, so my name's Anastasia. I'm doing my PhD in disaster displacement in Australia, looking at how we can, map houses at risk of displacement, but then also looking at areas that have been impacted retrospectively. I've just been accepted for publication of an article that looks at Australia's policies around planning for disasters. And what I've found is that we don't preemptively plan for displacement or homelessness. And so that is not currently reflected in any local, state or federal policy that has real tangible planning for this crisis. So I just wanted to share that to answer that question.
Yes. Yes. How many do you need?
Thanks for that.
Why is that?
So I think there's just, I was trying to put everyone on mute, but I think there's someone who's maybe not on mute. I'll just see if there's another question. You can use if you'd like to ask a question, because it's just an ordinary Zoom, you can just put your hand up and then I can call on you to ask the question. Don't just have to use the chat function. And I wondered too, I'm imagining probably a few people have joined from areas that have been affected by disasters and these sorts of housing issues. Please do feel free to jump in with a reflection from the area that you've lived or worked in as well. One of the things just on that is that I was based for a long time at Council to Homeless Persons in Victoria, and so we were sort of very interested in the the fires in Gippsland. And one of the consequences of that was that housing, there were sort of pluses and minuses for people who were homeless prior to the fires. The plus was that there was a significant investment from government in case management capacity, which was provided to local, there was resources provided to local organisations. And so people perhaps then were able to access, emergency payments, case management support, a whole range of kind of supports that were provided by the local community health centre, which wasn't discriminating. They were also providing homelessness services. So I'm sure they weren't discriminating between people who were homeless formally and who were housed formally in the provision of case management support that had been funded through the emergency response, which was much greater level of support than would have been available otherwise to people who are homeless. But on the downside, all of the temporary accommodation that would ordinarily be occupied by people who are fleeing family violence or had other issues around homelessness was occupied by people who were displaced as a consequence of the fires or by workers who were coming in to support the recovery effort. So, and even places in what do we call it, transitional housing and spaces that came available in public housing were reserved for people displaced from the fires. So that sort of pushed people up the priority list. And in fact, there was just no access to any of that accommodation to anyone who was had, the ordinary pathway into homelessness. So that created really significant problems. I wonder if anyone has had, I know that there were some similar experiences in New South Wales. Just looking at the list of names to see if there's anyone I recognise who. Linda, you want to jump in?
And when I can get myself off mute, exactly what you were saying, Kate, that's what's happened here. So I'm in Tweed and just from the language people use, so people say Lismore floods, but it's Northern Rivers floods. So being in Tweed Heads, a lot of the displaced people were moved to Tweed, so the temporary accommodation then turned into the emergency accommodation that was, through DCJ, so Department of Community and Justice. So that impact then on the social housing list, the priorities went over to those flood affected people and they got the housing, so yeah. And that actually has brought a lot of anger amongst community members across the board as well. So we've have got those issues as well.
Yeah. Thank you for calling me out on that, Linda. You're right. I shouldn't just call it this one place because it was, but and we did speak to folks across the board up in the Northern Rivers. But what you're highlighting there is part of the challenge, and it's the fact that like the social housing wait lists are already really long up on the Northern Rivers, right? But they're so long that people effectively have to find an alternative, and so they might be living in a granny flat or like finding some other sort of informal situation. But what's happened, or what when we're speaking to people, is that a lot of those people who had found alternative solutions, those alternative solutions disappeared, and so suddenly they were always on the social housing wait list, but just suddenly just rocketed to the top. And so there's a lot of disruption and just a huge spike in demand, and as you say, completely upset the sort of usual order of affairs of how people would get processed through temporary accommodation and into social housing. It was really challenging.
Yeah, so if anyone has got a quick fix, I'd love one. Because the team that I look after, we're about supporting those people through the recovery and finding alternative accommodation is one of those. But then also supporting people who are being put into the pod villages who are finding it quite difficult to adjust to that sort of village life, because a lot of them were, if not homeless, on the fringes of it anyway prior to the disaster. So, and then all of those social things that come with that in terms of, alcoholism and drugs and etc. are impacting that village as well. So it's not a simple fix. Such David's already said it at the beginning. Whatever we do, it's going to be a long road.
Yeah, well, at least it's a conversation to begin, isn't it? About how. So, and I sort of jumped in at the beginning, so I should sort of do the intro bit now. But the bit that I forgot to mention is that we're having this conversation in the context of the government developing a 10-year national housing and homelessness plan. And so obviously the environment that we're having a national housing and homelessness plan has been created is this Australian environment where this is the reality that fires and floods and other I won't call them natural disasters, other disasters commonly have these impacts, and so we need to be planning for that. But of course, the everyday business of homelessness is a disaster in itself. So we need to be planning to housing people across the community, but then also able to respond to the shocks that happen with weather. So it does strike me that if we had a really very large social and affordable housing sector that wasn't, instead of having 10-year wait lists to get into, had a sort of, 3 or 4% vacancy rate. And so there was, people could access that when they needed, that the resilience in the context and ability to move people into available housing would be much greater when a set of housing's damaged over here, then there might be more capacity to move people into housing and then to have less reliance on temporary accommodation. I find it hard to imagine responding to losing thousands of homes overnight, not having any temporary solutions, even if that is something as temporary as tents. I'm not sure if you wanted to respond to that, David, and sort of really bring home the case against temporary accommodation.
Well, if I'm totally homeless and somebody says temporary accommodation, I'm not going to say no. So I get it. It's just some of the issues. So, as you said, there are no simple things, no stuff. It's already what it is. But I don't want to come over as someone who's saying it's hopeless, because it's absolutely not hopeless. And we get better at it and we incrementally change. And it's a long-term thing, and it's a shift in power. And that really does need to happen at the moment. And a lot of people are talking it, but unless and until decision makers, state, federal government, get it in a way that they will act on it, we're going to keep having this conversation. I mean, I always forget what decade this is, because there ain't nothing new here. It really is that need for that systemic shift. And, so yeah.
Well, any other last comments, or so I'll start to wrap up. Because I think one of the Community Housing Industry Association and National Shelter and myself at Homelessness Australia, partly through the lens of talking about this event, have started talking about having, a subsequent conversation, and we're sort of in the early stages of planning that. But I think one of the things that became clear is the need to bring government decision makers into the conversation and really be starting to think about, well, what needs to change in terms of what government are planning, so that we're not just all scratching our heads about how to respond to something which is a problem that we know is going to happen. So we absolutely have to respond to it. And so it would be great to see folks again. And I think one of the plans is to, and although in a more informal way, we have a mix of people from community, government and academia and the sector here, but in a more formally structured way, have a conversation that involves the different levels of government, as well as community sector organisations that have been active in responding in a disaster situation, and then also people who've been affected and lived through those changes. Often community sector organisations and people who've responded and lived through those changes are the same people, because people are responding to the need of others whilst they're also experiencing these issues themselves. Same with local government, I expect, Amanda. We'll look forward to that next conversation. But in the meantime, thanks very much for participating in this conversation, and all the best, Amanda, for the delivery of housing over these short number of weeks you have until the skies start falling again. So all the best, and thank you very much to Ryan and David and Amanda for sharing all of those thoughts, and thanks to everyone for participating.
And thank you for putting this on, Kate, and shining a light on this stuff. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.